Yes, so we're back. We're back with the second part of Chapter 8, the death of class debate. And what a debate it is. Last time we got through all of the first half, which introducing the general propositions from the debate and some core propositions around defining the nature of class. Today we're going to jump into the evidence and see what evidence there is for this mysterious disappearance of class. Kyle, do you want to take this first slide and see how we get on?
All right. So our first slide says the evidence. Have class boundaries disappeared? Wright has researched the permeability of class boundaries. Permeability refers to the extent to which the lives of individuals move across different kinds of social boundaries. Permeability can be for any kind of social boundary: race, gender, class, occupation, nationality, etc. In Wright's research, he has focused on three particular kinds of events. So these are intergenerational class mobility, cross-class friendship formation, and cross-class household composition. The class structure concept Wright uses in his research sees class relations in capitalist societies as organized along three underlying dimensions, each with their own divisions. So the first dimension is property. So this would include employers, the petty bourgeois, who he defines as people who are self-employed without employees, and finally, employees. So these are people that are divided into different categories by the property dimension. Then we have the authority dimension. This is managers, supervisors, and non-managerial employees. And then we have expertise or skills. So that would be professionals, skilled employees, or non-skilled. Permeability is then defined as a boundary crossing event that links the poles of these trichotomies. Friendships between employers and employees, for example, would count as an instance of permeability across the property boundary. But a friendship between a worker and a petty bourgeois, or between a petty bourgeois and an employer, would not. Okay.
Is that right?
Is that correct?
Let me check. So what does it say? Friendships between employer and employees, for example, would count as instance of permeability across the property boundary, but a friendship between a worker and a petty bourgeois, or between a petty bourgeois and employer. Right. So it's only if it goes from to the right to the left, but to the middle.
So the extremes.
Yeah.
The extremes. The middle does not count.
Defines permeability in the point above is then defined as a boundary crossing event that links the poles of these trichotomies.
Yes, it has to be the poles.
Pole to pole.
It cannot be the middle term. Right. Okay. So the empirical problem is then to explore the relative odds of permeability events across these three class boundaries, as well as the odds of events between different specific locations within the class structure.
Okay, Kyle, you have something to say about the definition of petty bourgeois here, I think.
Yeah, this is understandable in the name of sort of conceptual parsimony, like just creating a workable framework as a sociologist that you can slot people into. But this idea that the petty bourgeois are people who are self-employed without employees is just absolutely bizarre. It is like, it's so far from any definition of petty bourgeois that you would expect to sort of coming out of the organic, like, Marxist tradition, where, like, you know, oftentimes we think of the PB as, like, you know, shopkeepers or dentists or something like this. All people who definitely have employees, not people who are self-employed without employees. They're not even exploiting anyone in capitalist terms. So it is very, very strange as a definition. But if you are
Sure.
putting the property dimension in terms of employers versus employees, and then you want a middle term, then this makes sense as a middle term, but it does not make sense as a definition of the petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I tend to say petty propertarian because without exploitation, you might not want to say bourgeois even when there's bourgeois property involved or something.
Yes, well,
The big
because
bourgeoisie, let's say.
it makes a kind of sense to say that self-employed workers have some degree of ownership of the means of production, right? Because that allows them to produce something on their own without the help of others. But it's a very specious definition of petty bourgeoisie. And the problem here is not so much that Wright is constructing this tripartite categorical distinction between the employers, the self-employed without employees, and the employees. It's that people then go on to use this definition in other contexts based on Wright's sociological research, which is a thing that I've actually seen in sort of in the wild talking to people. Like, well, I define petty bourgeoisie as self-employed without employees because that's how Wright defines it.
Well, I think it flows pretty logically from an emphasis on exploitation as a locus of class, or as being the primary locus of property relations in class, because you have exploiters, you have the exploited, you have the excluded middle. And so, you know, one might object to the name, but that's the basic typology. And that maybe it doesn't properly correspond to petty bourgeois in the historical sense.
Well, yeah, but the problem is then that people can use this, you know, they can sort of equivocate about the petty bourgeoisie based on Wright's sociological research, which is not about the petty bourgeoisie.
Which is in line with the political usage of analytical Marxism and social democratic, like, you know, small is beautiful, like small business stuff. Like, okay.
Yeah, and like people who are absolutely not bourgeois being called that, when it's like you could be so poor and fit into this category. Like,
well, right.
This is absolutely not a good metric of like I am higher on the property ladder than the employees.
Like in terms of productive property, like I'm not sure about that. Like it doesn't mean higher on the class ladder
because
like
there are
someone has a different set of property interests, and you have to look for that even in like unionizing efforts among like low wage truckers or something. All right.
Yes.
All
No,
right.
that's fair.
Thing. You know something about a trucker strike that's different than a strike of people who are structurally proletarian who don't have any small propertarian interest.
The thing is though that like I agree with you in that sense, but I also think that there are so many economic niches where people technically fit into this definition, but they're actually poor as shit.
Like
yes, of course.
The trucker,
and
like
so
the truckers,
calling them bourgeois is like fucked up.
The truckers are a weird one because they actually generally own their truck, or maybe they might be in debt for it, but they could have an asset that could literally be worth a business asset that could be worth a couple of $100,000 even, right? Where most self-employed people work out of their homes, or they have a van and some small tools and shit like that, that they're not actual, like they don't have a lump of capital invested.
Right.
Yep. So that's my whole beef with this thing. It's about the political uses of it. It's not about the sort of, you know, categorical distinction that he's engaging in there. Because if you take out the term petty bourgeois, then I think it makes sense.
Why would he have done it this way, Kyle? Is it because you can't get enough bourgeois people to fucking sample?
No, I think it's because the term petty bourgeois is inherently imprecise and it doesn't fit nicely into an analytical framework. It's a bit fuzzy, right? Inherently, what it is.
I kind of wish he would pick a side as whether he uses Marxist terms or sociological terms, because I think in this particular instance, I would have preferred a less Marxist, more sociological definition. Modern conflict theory and sociology doesn't use bourgeois and proletariat unless they're talking specifically about Marx's philosophy, Marx's thoughts as a man, not even Marxist conflict theory. So I kind of would prefer if you just left that out, unless he was using a more Marxist definition of petite bourgeois, which even the Marxist definition is still fuzzy, but like there might be a time and place to use that in this text.
I have seen this in other places. It's not just Wright that does this, though. So
no, but Wright or any other sociologist, like I would just prefer it if they stuck with if you're doing sociology, just do sociology. I like that.
From Marxists, I have seen Marxists do this from a similar mode of reasoning. And it can lead them to be very heartless against low-income petty proprietors, and not sensitive to their interests, and not sensitive to the possibility of coalition between people with a small amount of property but very low income, and the proletariat. And it can cause this, this fever about cross-class alliances between people with completely irreconcilable interests, because people are too fixated on property, not interested in income and the sort of real weirdness of how class is lived and experienced and acted upon. So I don't know. I suppose I get the concern, but also like this structural like difference between the proletariat and even the most low income petty proprietors who have a small amount of like capital has marked differences in organization patterns in workers' movements. And stuff in a way that Marxists have consistently causally identified. And it's also driven a lot of total political heartlessness and ruthless expropriation of people that we would consider poor. So it's sort of a Marxist tradition.
And it's kind of like, well, okay, so like is somebody who is a independent, quote unquote, bike courier delivering food petty bourgeois because they have some shitty bike that they ride around on, and they are, according for tax purposes, self-employed without employees. It gets pretty ridiculous in some cases,
Kyle,
in terms of bourgeois property relations.
I'm coming for that bike.
Well, it makes a lot more sense, because I actually think, because I've worked for like rideshare companies or something, and like you own your car, but like it's because because you're using your own like personal property as capital, kind of like eats into your personal life, and so there's this whole other dimension to that specific genre of example that I think is like a limit case that speaks to the genuine, weirdness of trying to draw a boundary in real life. But I don't know. If you're looking for the moment between life and death, you can get really fine and not find it too.
No, sure, yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing is just like whenever you think of petty bourgeois, like you would think of somebody who has at least one employee. It's just
somebody with
such
no
a
employee.
massive gap between the general usage of the concept and the definition here that it just kind of blew my mind.
Well, this whole categorization, I think, works well except for petty bourgeois, because, employers, sociologically, you're casting a bigger net than just the bourgeoisie, the way Marxists typically use it.
Yep, sure.
Employers would include what we typically think of as petty bourgeois in this case.
Like someone.
No, absolutely.
Someone. I mean, it could be as simple as someone who owns a taco truck and
has one person their brother works under them. That's it.
By this typology, they've crossed into the big bourgeoisie or the employer thing. But I think that's actually why he doesn't use, for the most part, he doesn't say proletarian bourgeois. He's much more precise on the other ones. Employers, employees.
If you just took out the petty bourgeois thing and stuck with self-employed without employees, it's a mouthful, but it is like a way better definition.
I also like in real life, like I'm trying to think of people who would fit this, and like what artisans, like who.
Like my partner was one of these people until recently.
I'm one of them now. I'm one of them.
Well, I'm going to expropriate you, Tom. I mean, I'm coming for that bike.
Expropriate what? Like my audio
expropriate
mic?
your broken electric piano.
Yeah, I'm coming for that piano.
You might engage in some non-sanctioned extra state piano playing for personal profit. That would be disallowed.
It would cost you more to like bring it as cargo to America than
that's literally true. Yeah,
it's worth the state inefficiency for me. I'm getting it.
I want to get my left arm recliner because I have a left arm armchair. I don't know if people out there know this, but I have an armchair from which I criticize social movements, and so I want to bring it with me overseas. And you're right, Tom. It's real expensive.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like just if I can get it ready for next year's Christmas carol that I record for the patrons.
Yes, very good. You see, you're already scheming to make profit, Tom.
Oh yeah,
with your electric piano.
Yeah, that's right. With your productive capital. No, I don't know, man. Like I know so few people that work with their own tools with zero eye towards employing somebody.
Right.
If they're
not employing someone else now, they want to.
They're sort of like maybe dreaming of it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying dreams count as capital, but you know what I mean? Like I haven't gone that far into the post-structuralist rabbit hole.
I mean, I think that, there's something to that, but also like I do know a fair number of people in that position who just don't want employees because they don't want the headache. They're sort of like inherently, adverse to becoming an employer. Yeah.
Is that a personal disposition?
Yeah, it's a personal thing. Yeah.
But by virtue of their class interests, it would totally rule for them to like.
I
don't know.
Yeah.
To
become an employer. Yeah.
Yeah, to do some grind work for them so they can do something. Yeah.
Also, like, again, they're that transition position because it would also totally rule for them to have a unionized job where they don't get the shit exploited out of them.
Yes. Oh yes. Yeah. That's totally right. And there's like a because they're low income and very likely to continue to be like getting the shit end of the forgive the expression, the rent market, there's distributions like across these kind of weird kind of postmodern markets. And so some kind of proletarian, class coalition would suit their interests, arguably more than a bourgeois one.
Because even if they had an employee, they would still have a small capital and they would still get screwed. So, yeah.
But I think like Wright provides a good framework in the other chapters for sort of understanding why by profession, like people's kind of smaller interests, like I still think there's some class trend in that kind of stuff because people that got nothing do tend to have a little more solidarity than people who have a little chunk of something that helps them pay the bills. Like, there's something.
If they're not in a position of complete desperation where I mean,
even then, man, like I worked with small businesses that were failing, and like people, the owners get so. I've seen a lot of small business people get real kind of reactionary. Like,
but they're employers. It's a different thing. Right. It's like I don't want to get into it too much, but it's the position that my partner was in doing this kind of work was so bad that we both have sort of like health problems that we're having to pay for now because we couldn't afford private medical insurance. And it took a massive toll, and it was like very it was under minimum wage work, like it is not it was not good. It was not the kind of thing where it was like, oh my god, I must hold on to my property. Like, there are like sort of both sides to this, because you can imagine also like the sort of like high-powered contractor who is like making bank and would absolutely not block with the proletariat, right?
Yeah, but they're necessarily a social exception. So no, I see your point, and I kind of barely consider, if people have like a hammer and some screwdrivers or something, I hardly call that capital. I don't know, like capital usually refers to something culture. It's culturally significant in some way. Like it could be landed property, which is culturally significant for reasons beyond capitalist horizons. Like it's just I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't need to go into that, I think. And then there's like industrial, like a factory or some shit. Like, and there's some stuff that's obviously capital, and there's some stuff like, I don't know.
I think a very Arizona example is like, a pool cleaner. Usually somebody will own like a van or like a truck and a bunch of tools, but like, it's kind of like a very easy and common business to do in Arizona because a lot of people have pools. The startup costs are less than if you already have a van, you're halfway there. You just got to get like the fucking tools to clean the pool properly.
Yeah, you could use your personal property to do the job, right?
At first I was like, oh man, it's going to go in on this definition right now, and we're just trying to defend the basic concept of class shit. But the more I think about it, so many markets right now operate with this structure, and there's sort of an effort to deproletarianize workers to be low income, structurally petty propertarian. It's sort of part of the neoliberal, quote unquote, kind of restructuring that when you can do that, do it. So that, you internalize the ideology as a matter of structure.
You internalize the ideology, but there's also less legal protections for an independent contractor.
Yeah. Right. Totally. And it's also like the internet's able to drive this by huge monopolies, Uber, et cetera, and then isolate your workers, so there is definitely
Uber's the most alienated workforce I've ever seen in my life. Like the people that did union campaigns with Uber, like those people were associating drivers at all in a way that was totally alien to even like super alienating job like Walmart. Like in Walmart, you fucking walk in there with some people and you're there.
Yeah.
Right. You see the people and you know that they work there. You don't even know the other drivers. I don't know. I've made this point several times. But it's still, it always blows my mind compared to Marx's Read of the Proletariat. And, it's not like I don't consider an Uber driver worker because they fucking own their car or something. It's just like I can see where some people, they organize the LLC and they feel like a small business person. And you can't talk them out of it.
It's the internet's that great. It's that great device for creating, like, instead of the proletariat, sacks of potatoes. It's like the peasants, keep them isolated and unable to talk to each other in the workplace.
Yeah.
We structure the market so they don't have as much of an interest in it.
Well, even peasants have villages and communal ties that they could talk to their fucking village mates, like.
I love hearing Americans talking about peasant life. It's funny.
I'm not like rosy-eyed about peasant life, but like that was the basis of like Russian peasant communism.
Yeah, and there's also a bunch of just like weird, I don't know, semi-feudal. It's not feudal. Feudal's the wrong word, but it's like this weird like agrarian kind of persistence in American culture that influences the development of suburbia, and like it's all come back with such a vengeance. Like this boundary here, the difference between worker and someone with some small property interest that might have an eye towards employment, but might not, and their fortunes are pretty much tied to how good is the economy doing overall, or some smaller market fluctuation that benefits them specifically. And that determines so much about the stuff that's going to be important towards the end of the book, their political interest in forming a coalition. And this is going to be a big devil in the detail when thinking about what Wright is really saying at the end of the book. Because it's going to look like Wright is saying, we should buddy up with the petty bourgeoisie. But for the most part, he's not really talking about any sort of employer whatsoever.
Yeah, he's not
Yeah.
talking about people that we would actually think of as the petty bourgeoisie.
Which is very
So-
weird why he would
Yeah.
call them that. Anyway, let's go on. We've spent
Yep,
half an
let's
hour.
move on. The objection is noted, and we move on. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's defend the concept of class.
Correct. Who wants Ezra? Do you want to take the second slide then?
Let's do it. The evidence. Have class boundaries disappeared? The basic findings of the research were as follows. The property boundary is generally the least permeable of the three boundaries for all three kinds of events: mobility, friendships, and household composition. This is followed by the skill and expertise boundary, and then the authority boundary. The rank ordering, or relative permeability, holds for the four countries studied: US, Canada, Sweden, Norway. The odds of mobility between a working class location, that is a non-managerial, non-skilled employee, and an employer location is about 25% of what it would be if the link between these two locations was random. The odds of a close personal friendship between these locations is about 20% of what it would be if these events were random, and the odds of a two-earner household containing an employer married to a worker are about 10% of the random association. The odds of events linking workers and the petty bourgeoisie, on the other hand, are generally only modestly different from random for all three kinds of events. The class boundary between workers and petty bourgeois is therefore 3 to 6 times more permeable than the boundaries between workers and employers. None of these results demonstrates that class boundaries are the least permeable of all social boundaries in capitalist societies. In the US, racial boundaries are undoubtedly less permeable to household composition than are class boundaries, and in some countries, religious affiliation may be a much less permeable boundary than class for certain kinds of events. But these results unequivocally indicate that class boundaries have not disappeared. The coefficients for events across the property and skill expertise boundaries are significantly negative in all countries at p less than 0.001 level of statistical significance in nearly all cases.
Like that P0.001 that's a very strict measure.
That is very strict.
Like normally you're doing something is like 0.25 or 0.05. Yeah, 0.025 or 0.05, but 0.001 is like 1 in 1,000. Yeah. So it's incredibly significant. And you can tell it's incredibly significant because those things are 20%, only 25% mobility between employee and managerial. Close personal friendship is only 20%. Odds of an employer marrying a worker is 10% of random. They're incredibly strong statistical correlations, shall we put it?
Yeah, and this is just appeal to lived experience.
There's lived experience, and then there's just the data as well. Like they both argue in that fact. Because the thing about lived experience is that for many people, because these relationships hold, like they don't really have very much to do with the other pole outside of the workplace. So it's not necessarily front of mind. So showing the data is, I think, like a good sort of like encouragement to check your lived experience and actually think about it. Be like, oh yeah, this is true.
Yeah, can I picture myself dating or living, marrying like any of these small business people who do employ others ever that I've worked for? And the answer is no. Ew.
Yeah, fuck no.
Get away from me.
Fuck no.
Do not touch me. Stop.
Stop touching me.
Yeah.
Anyway.
The odds of a close personal friendship between Sophie and
Elon Musk.
Yeah, pretty
BFF, me and Musk.
Pretty small. I'm also glad for the attention that Wright pays to as the sort of implicit class relations of families and people in families.
Yeah.
Like, people that don't work in relation to others. Because, like, you can't understand the left without understanding people who, don't work and are related to someone who has some money. let alone the economy. But I'm just saying, like, vital for navigating political movements.
Yes, totally.
Absolutely. Okay, Sophia, do you want to hit the next slide?
Sure. The evidence. Has meaningful inequality disappeared? Have inequalities in the distribution of capital declined to the point in recent years that it no longer matters much for people's lives? Pekulski and Waters are correct that compared to 100 years ago, perhaps, there is a more egalitarian distribution of wealth in most capitalist countries. This does not, however, imply that the distribution has equalized to the point that the basic nexus between class and capital asset holding has been broken. In 1983, the richest 1% of U.S. households owned 50 to 60 times their per capita share of capitalist assets like bonds, stocks, and business assets. This was before the massive increase in wealth concentration that occurred in the last decades of the 20th century and continues to this day. By 2012, the top 0.1% of households in the U.S. had as much wealth as the bottom 90. In 1990, the average family income of the top 1% of income earners in the U.S. was just under $549,000. On average, over 50% of the total came directly from capital assets, not including an additional $61,000 from self-employment earnings. In contrast, the average family income of the bottom 90% was approximately $29,000, with less than 10% coming from capital assets. The inegalitarian distribution of capital assets is clearly consequential. The distribution of ownership rights in capitalist production affects the stability and distribution of jobs. One would be hard-pressed to convince a group of newly unemployed workers from a factory that has closed because the owner moved production abroad that their lack of ownership of capitalist asset had no significant consequences for their lives. If the workers themselves owned the firm as a cooperative, or if it were owned by the local community, different choices would have been made. So, I mean, reading this, like, this is where lived experience kind of plays a role again, where I'm just like, how could Polish Man and Roger Waters argue that this shit doesn't matter? Like, are you fucking kidding me?
Roger Waters would never say that.
But even not lived experience, I immediately think of the L curve. It's just something I learned when I was an undergraduate. It's something that a perfectly liberal person can look at and be like, yeah, that's fucked. So, on the other hand, like, I get why one would make this case if you're kind of more inclined to, be a right-winger, I suppose. Like, yeah, compared to, like, 100 years ago when a lot of the capitalist countries were still semi-feudal, things are a lot more egalitarian. It's, like, undeniable. But, like...
I don't know.
That's not true. No,
Right.
they're more unequal than they ever have been at any point in history.
Because the top is so high up, it's like some people can't afford food and some people are in space. There's a quality difference as well.
Most of the gains that were made, most of that has seemed to be given back in inequality rankings. That the inequality rankings are nearly back to 1929 levels, I think. It's probably fair. I know there's a lot of argumentation around it, but it does seem generally that's reasonably true. So we're back to where we were.
I think we're quite past that point after the pandemic, Tom. It's truly worse than it ever has been, as far as I understand. Like just reading reports about it over the last couple of years.
So in 2023, this all just seems like a whole alien discussion. But this is someone writing in like 2012 about a paper from 1996. And so it's basically interesting from a sociological history point of view. Like, remember when sociologists thought class was gone? Like when at the same time Clinton was gutting welfare,
But like, you can't take this argument as a scholar. Like, this is obviously not scholarly. It's obviously just a bullshit. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm there's a lot of politically motivated scholarship. There's a lot of bad, like hacky, politically motivated lauded because because it has ideological valence.
Right.
Like there's a lot of stuff.
That's
a lot of stuff like that. And that's like a part of academic culture. It's part of pop intellectual culture, even more so. It continues to be a part of pop intellectual culture. It's pretty strange that this was acceptable.
It wasn't as bad in the 90s, but like you brought up Clinton cutting welfare. Like it started with the Democrats in the late 70s in the United States with cutting like labor protections and stuff like that, and it's continued for at least like over 10 years. So even by the time they're writing this, like it's so nakedly like not true, but it's laughably ridiculous now.
I would just say it was laughable at the time.
It was laughable at the time, but the thing was that it wasn't so much that there was sort of an overwhelming amount of scholarship that was saying that class didn't exist at the time. It was more that everybody just sort of tacitly had agreed not to talk about class. And I think the people who were outright denying that it existed were in the minority, because it was like, oh, we don't study that anymore. That was very much the mentality at the time, was like, yeah, like, oh, class is over. It like, it's just not, we don't even talk about it anymore.
Yeah, because all the funding for it dried up.
Yeah.
But also it played these type of arguments played massive ideological roles in that, like the third way of Tony Blair and Clinton and all that. For sure. Yeah, it's just I'm just saying, like, sort of that question of like, how could you have sort of absurd arguments like this largely unchallenged or unexamined? It's because like there was sort of a massive hole in people's perception of reality at that point in time that was politically constructed. Right. Okay. Let me take this next slide. Has meaningful inequality disappeared? An objection could be made to Wright's analysis that he has grossly exaggerated the levels of inequality in distribution of assets, since pension funds of various sorts are among the biggest holders of stock and other financial assets. Shouldn't those workers covered by pension funds be considered quasi-capitalists by their virtue of connection to these assets? Doesn't this effectively erode the class distinction between workers and employers? The experience of conflict in Sweden over the wage earners funds in the 1970s sheds light on the nature of the class relations. In the 1970s, a proposal in Sweden known as the Meidner Plan was made by the left of the Labour movement and the Social Democratic Party, which would enable pension funds to be used by unions to gradually gain ownership of Swedish corporations. Corporations would have been forced by law to give stock to these funds as part of the benefits package for workers. And over time, this would have resulted in a shift of real ownership from the Swedish capitalist class to the unions. All of this was to be done at real market prices, so there was no question of confiscation. The Swedish bourgeoisie massively and vigorously opposed this proposal. The plan represented a fundamental shift from pension funds as a source of forced savings available for investment to those funds being used to transform the governance structure of Swedish industry, and thus ultimately the class structure. In the end, the proposal was watered down to the point where it no longer posed any kind of threat. What this episode reflects is the fact that the various forms of indirect ownership of assets represented by such things as pension funds do not in fact constitute a significant erosion of the class relations of ownership and control of productive assets. What matters is the way power relations are articulated to formal ownership rights. See the Soviet control of production, I wrote there. But, this is interesting because, like, the fact that your pension either comes from the state or it comes from, like, your own private thing is more a question of form than, like, content. If there was no private pensions and everything was state pensions and it was paid from tax revenues, it wouldn't be as easy for the right to make that argument because, the form of how they get their pensions are different. So
it's just fucking obfuscation to say that these things, they're just kind of the same. Like, what? Like, yeah, The Meitner plan is the kind of thing that made me interested in social democracy to begin with. Is that there were, even as late as the 1970s, still attempts to use the corporate structures emerging in the 20th century to the advantage to change the property form of capitalism in a democratic way that is like proletarian in some capacity. That through a corporate structure, the proletariat would eventually like actually own things and run things in some distant modern capacity. And I've tried to see like another way forward for this over the last decade, but I think so much of the so-called like neo-Kautskyist like resurgence I was a part of with Jacobin and the cult I started, like it's really just denying the science about how corporate dynamics work, and so much of the 20th century socialist stuff is just dead wrong on some of this basic sociology.
And like I've always wondered, the Swedish prime minister, the leader at SDP party in Sweden at the time was Olaf Palme, and he was assassinated in the 80s. And I wonder how linked it was to these types of proposals, to be honest.
I don't know. Like it is really one thing to say like people gave it a shot then, and even if they were even if there were people at the time writing about how dumb they were, like you could still like see some like no one had ever like done this for a sustained way in this like historically sustained effort. I don't know. It was one thing to be a part of it and have a lot of moral force in people's lives riding on it and try it at the time. And it's another thing to be like, I like this strategy because, unconsciously there's a nice cushy position for it. I know it obviously doesn't work like logically and historically, but I like it. Let's take it for a spin.
It's a radical strategy that the capitalist class is very happy for a left party to have as a strategy.
Yeah,
because I don't.
A threat.
I don't think anyone should seriously attempt to do the Meitner plan again. I mean, you just have to read Meitner's own article on why the Meitner plan failed to understand, like, it's not a good idea. But it was worth a shot, certainly.
Right.
In a country where social democracy it was as powerful as it was in Sweden, give it a go.
It still couldn't go. It still couldn't happen. What did he say, actually? What was his article like, Kyle?
Oh, basically just talks about how the plan was largely separated from the working class, and it was something that was pushed by the leadership of the unions and the party. And so when the going got tough, they were really isolated from any social base. And it's like, it was so abstracted from any kind of labor struggle that it was not something that the workers would strongly defend when the bourgeoisie came after it. That's more or less the gist of what Meitner says.
Right. It'd be the exact same thing that if Bernie or Corbyn had managed to win a vote and tried to do their policies, they would have got absolutely chewed up.
I mean, this is like literally the most abstracted and gradualist form of the seizure of the means of production that you could conceive of, right? Like it's just regularly negotiated purchases on the market under the auspices of state control. It's like as abstract as it could possibly be, and therefore it's not really something that people can feel tangibly and defend tangibly. And I think just taking that, like, I think it's more extreme than anything Corbyn or Bernie were proposing. Because you look at something like the Green New Deal that Bernie was proposing, and there's some pretty basic stuff there, and in terms of retraining if you work in a fossil fuel industry and getting bought out of your job that like people could pretty clearly relate to. But this is just the highest possible level of abstraction, and that's why it's really not an effective way to undermine the entire power of the capitalist class, because you're just not going to get the workers to invest in it that way. Like, it's like the kind of thing you would read in, like, I don't know, the back of the business section in the Financial Times, right? Like, it is not something that working class struggle is going to mobilize around.
Right. They're not going to be out on the street saying, we're fighting for the,
yeah,
control for
I'm
our
fighting
pensions.
so that in 2050, my grandchildren will buy the last shares of a Swedish joint stock company, and we will own in common this syndicate.
Workers' control. When do we want it? In a couple generations.
Yeah, like, I don't know.
No, it's not even that. It's not
There's
workers' control. It's actually
tornado.
worker ownership. What do we want?
Yeah,
Worker
true.
ownership of some of the means of production through
Well,
our pensions. When do we want it? 2047.
Well, it's still a pretty, like, I think it's a pretty radical plan, and it's one of the more radical plans in corporate socialism. If you think of socialism as a stupid extra stage, like Leninists and Social Democrats did, the essential Kautsky Social Democratic black hole that sucks in all the potentials of the workers' movement in the 20th century. But, like, I don't know, I get it. I get the Meitner plan, and I think, him understanding why something didn't work has to be worked into our models for social dynamics, and that should go for right to...
I absolutely respect what they did as an experiment, but to repeat it would be folly. That's all. Yeah.
Okay, Kyle, do you want to take this next slide then?
At the core of the Marxist conception of class is the problem of extracting labor effort from producers who do not own the means of production. One of the results of this problem is the efficiency wage, in which workers are paid more than their reservation wage in order to raise the cost of job loss, thus making them more hesitant to shirk. Another consequence will be the erection of an apparatus of monitoring and enforcement within firms. A third consequence is that employers make technological choices partially in terms of the effects of alternative technologies on monitoring and social control. This does not imply, of course, that the class dimensions of technical choice are always the most important, or even that they are always significant, but simply that employers are not indifferent to the effect of alternative technologies on their capacity to monitor and extract labor effort. There is considerable empirical evidence for each of these effects. Most economists do not use the language of class analysis in discussions of this principal agent problem because they take the distribution of property rights within the capitalist firm for granted. Yet this distribution of property rights is a central dimension of class structure. Making the class character of the problem explicit has the advantage of focusing attention on the ways in which variations in the class relations of production might affect the principal agent problem.
What this made me think of is, at my job, since I started working there has been a change to which, like, they could always monitor what we were doing. I answered the phones as a scheduler, medical scheduler. So they could always monitor if we were ready to take calls or not. But now there's a whole algorithm that plans how much workforce, how much hours are needed at a given time to make sure we have enough people to answer the phones. And so now every single minute is scrutinized to a high degree in a way that it wasn't before. Like, someone would say something if you weren't ready for a while, but like, they've gotten so strict on this. So much so that when I got in trouble at my job, I brought up Foucault. Bringing up Foucault to your supervisors is super fun. I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, that's a winning move. Well, you actually brought up the panopticon. You didn't bring up Foucault. Technically, you were just bringing up this interesting English invention from like a long time ago, and and kind of spelling out the panoptic principle at work. Like
I
you're
brought up
making
the
Foucauldian argument.
I was making a Foucauldian argument. I
Yeah.
brought up the Jeremy Bentham
Yeah.
idea of the panopticon as the ideal prison, and then I was like, but actually it kind of fucking sucks. Because my job is full of that soft power shit. And like,
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of patience for that kind of passive aggressive thing, so I could be kind of snotty with them at times.
Yeah, well, and like there is the essay by Graeber that I mention all the time on GIU, the flying cars and the declining rate of profit, right?
Mhm.
Where he points out that since the 70s, a great deal of technical investment has been towards surveillance technologies and not towards other things. And it's just kind of like the same argument that Wright is making here, but looking at it as a historical trend as opposed to just like a sort of decision matrix. And so essentially we get a whole lot of cop shit baked into our technology, and that has been an ever increasing trend for quite a long time now.
Before I quit this job, I'm going to switch my Google Gmail profile picture to a picture of the Panopticon and see if anybody notices.
Yes.
I read a book by a guy called David Noble. He was like a historian, like a Marxist.
Oh my God. He Okay, Tom, I just have one thing to say about Noble. They were going to hire him at my alma mater, SFU. I'm not sure if it was in my department or in the humanities department, but it was one of them. And the university management lost their shit and did like a huge like organization effort to bar him from getting the job because they were terrified of him coming into the university.
Right, yeah. He wrote this book called Forces of Production, a social history of industrial automation. I read it. Like it's actually quite a dull book, it must be said, but it's talking about like the history, mainly of the history of machine tools in America in like post-war, and he shows how like the state threw loads and loads of investment into making the technology be able to be top-down, manager-driven, and not skilled machinists making the decisions. You know, and it was done at all stages. It was done like in the least efficient way, but for purely class reasons. And like this stuff is everywhere. Like I know myself, I built this computer system for a crowd I work with, and like all the class relations I've had to build into the software. You know, don't allow these people to see this because they wouldn't. We can't let them see that. They'd lose their shit if they knew what this other person was making in their job, etc., etc. And so it's like these type of things are at all levels in all of our not everything obviously, but like so much of our technology is driven through these class choices. You know, there's also there's that report. I think it's 20 years old now. I think it's an American one about what percentage of the American workforce are basically involved in surveillance or guarding the assets of the rich, and it works out at 25% of the American workforce. That was in, I think, 99, you know, so.
Yeah, so it's got to be
incredible.
higher now.
Right.
Yeah. And I will also mention another GIU thing. My former advisor, Andrew Feenberg, called this sort of specific implementation ethos of technology the technical code. So the thing that makes the technology take on the particular political configuration it does. So he wrote a whole bunch about that. If you want to go check that out.
So the big thing here about the principal agent problem, he's kind of hinting towards some stuff, I think, Esri by Herb and Gintis about like worker cooperatives.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's
from what, management science literature.
Yikes.
Am I mistaken?
No, it is.
Or is that just an application from like economics, or what is it? Kyle, I have a feeling you have.
I think those are it's the Venn diagram is a circle on that one. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, like you were saying, like that's a Wolf thing, and it's like, well, okay, but you know, Bowles, Gintis, Wolf, and Wright all worked at the same university, so You know, it's not a surprise they got a party line here, even though they disagree with each other on a number of things.